Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are around the world. Thanks for taking the time to join today's webinar from Real Story Group. This is the latest in our series of presentations around MarTech effectiveness. And today our founder, Tony Byrne, will walk through some of the key barriers that we're seeing that some folks are struggling with when it comes to being as effective as possibly can with their marketing technology. So this should be a really interesting presentation from Tony. We're really excited about this. And excuse me, just want to mention that these slides will be available to you within the next couple of days. So you can check for those on our site along with a recording of today's presentation. And if there are questions at the end of the session, we can get to those as well. But just to get us started here, just want to provide a little bit more background about Real Story Group, as I do see a number of new folks on the line with us. So we're different than your traditional analyst firm. We've been at this for 22 years now, and we, throughout that time, have strictly adhered to a completely independent model in the sense of we never work for the vendors that we cover in any way. We don't advise them on their strategy. We don't write white papers for them or anything like that. Our whole purpose is to be on the buy side of the table to help you in determining which of these vendors is going to be the right fit for what it is that you're trying to do. And so that is what our goal is when it comes to evaluating each of these vendors and advising you in terms of how best to put them into your MarTech stack. But today's focus is going to be around how effective you are with that MarTech stack. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony, who will take us through the heart of today's presentation. Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Really interesting topic for us, particularly as we work with more and more MarTech leaders around the world. And if you're in MarTech, you know that you have to navigate this subway map, which is the way that we divide vendors into different subway lines according to what marketplace they're in. And these are the different vendors that we evaluate, from everything from web content management to DAM, CDPs, e-commerce, and most recently AI. And so, you know, we're experts in these markets. We understand the vendor pros and cons. We live and breathe this stuff every day. But there's a separate issue that kind of overlays this, which is how well are your trains running? How effective are you with respect to your overall MarTech operation? And so earlier this year, we announced a free benchmarking service where you can essentially measure your effectiveness and measure it, compare it with your peers. And so if you haven't yet done it, I'll invite you to use this link, bit.ly/benchmartech. Scott can also put this in the chat window for you. And so you can just click through from there. You definitely want to try this out yourself, see where your enterprise fits in. What I'm going to be talking about today are some of the results of this, and even more so, how do you actually improve your score, which is another way of saying, how can you become more effective? So the benchmarking service works across 5 different dimensions. So starting on the far left, you've got operations, which includes governance, teams, planning, privacy, so forth. In the middle, you have what we call the 3 legs of the customer experience stool, which is content, data, and decisioning. So content gets you everywhere from content operations to component management, data, of course, customer 360, reporting, analytics, and all important activation. Decisioning ranges from testing and optimization all the way through to orchestration. One thing our council really stressed that we added to this was your business readiness as well across these 3. And then finally, on the far left is your technology platforms. How effective are you in terms of organizing and executing with respect to your MarTech platforms themselves? So these are the 5 dimensions and categories that you can benchmark yourself, and which north of 100 large enterprises have already benchmarked themselves. And so they've given us a little bit of data already to work off of. So some early results suggest that many of you are doing okay with respect to operations doing well with respect to content, struggling in the data decisioning and to some extent technology areas. These are scores out of a possible 25. So, you're batting, maybe getting a 12 or batting about 400 in operations, doing a little bit better with content, but in data and technology scoring maybe 10 out of 25. So some low scores in some of these areas. And so when you see these low scores, then you ask yourself, okay, what's getting in the way? What are some of the roadblocks that we can overcome to really execute more effectively? There's some stories behind the stories here. So the area that most organizations scored the lowest in is in decisioning. But if you break this down into 5 different categories, you can see that there's some improvement here on a scale of 5, some higher averages with respect to test and optimize and campaign management, things that we've been doing maybe with a little bit more experience over the years. Much lower scores when you get to personalization, orchestration, and certainly business readiness. So there's definitely a story here in particular around decisioning, and we'll come back to that later. This is an area where many of you are self-scoring relatively low, and so the question is then, do we need to do something about this? What do we do about it? Same thing with technology, a similar story, a lot of much more maturity around content platforms, much less maturity around data and decisioning platforms, and of course, AI and ML still somewhat incipient and experimental. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But what does this then translate to, and how do you overcome some of the barriers that are keeping you at the lower end of the range here? So let's just take a simple, this is a large firm that we know. This is how they ended up self-scoring as a group. And again, just a friendly reminder that you can try this yourself at any time. It's totally free. Those of you who are RSG subscribers, you get a few extra goodies, including PowerPoint outputs and so forth. But this is fairly standard, where again, on the data and decisioning side, relatively lower scores. And we see that a lot, in particular around data. But the larger story here is maybe what you want to do too is think about, maybe this is telling a story where you're out of balance. In other words, it's great that you're scoring, that they were to par with content and operations, doing relatively well there, but all the great operational chops and the content isn't going to help them a whole lot if they've got deficits with respect to data and then the decisioning logic that's going to drive these experiences. So part of the first thing that you really want to do is say, where are we out of whack? Where are we really lagging, and focus on that. And for many of you, I would argue probably most of you, one of the areas where you're really going to find yourself scoring more, lower than others is around data. And so getting your data house in order really becomes a high priority for you. So let's talk about a little bit about what that means. So many of you have seen RSG's MarTech services reference model. So this is a reference model for what we think the omni-channel stack of the 2020s should look like. This is the B2C version. There's also a B2B version. But you can sense the kind of flow here. At the top are engagement channels, and then you have interaction delivery environments. You have engagement services, where many of us have been building up really strong silos of capabilities, unfortunately siloed platforms as well. And so the way of the future really is going to be focusing more on enterprise foundation services, and those typically fall into 3 different pillars here that I talked about before. On the left, content and information; in the middle, data; and then decisioning. So let's begin in the middle tier, data. The first thing that you can do to improve your effectiveness is to work on this middle box of customer data operations. I think we're all really focused a lot on the orange box, customer data activation. That's exciting. That's where you get data leverage with customers, understanding who they are and what they need, and then delivering the right experience. And certainly enterprise data intelligence and analytics, modeling, reporting, also very sexy, very useful. But neither of those things are going to work very well unless you get your customer data operations, customer data management fixed. So, the real barrier to effective customer data leverage and insights that we've seen is really getting your customer data house in order. And I think if there was one thing that was going to dramatically improve the scores that we've seen, it's really focusing on this whole life cycle of ingesting, processing, and unifying customer data. If you're not doing that effectively underneath all the rest, then it's going to be difficult to show business value on top of that. So here's kind of a deeper look at what some of those capabilities might be. So this is a kind of a more detailed architectural slide. I'm not going to go into explaining this all, but if you look at the gray box, which is the customer data ecosystem, underneath it you see an enterprise data fabric, which has core data services and what we call a customer data hub. This has some heavy duty, typically data ops driven capabilities that really need to get sorted out before you can think about customer data insights, and in particular all the exciting stuff around customer data activation. Now, where this relates then is with a CDP, with a customer data platform, it can span the whole scope of these capabilities, or maybe just some limited scope of these capabilities. So part of one barrier you need to get over is to really understand which capabilities are going to render to which platforms. But you want to make sure that you're accounting for all of these capabilities, or you are going to suffer on the front end of the experience. And so really understanding your broader customer data architecture and making sure that it's sorted in a way that works for you. And there are different design patterns for these architectures, and obviously different scopes for CDPs. So what works for you might not work for someone else, and vice versa. But the key thing is to inventory and figure out which services go where, and then you can start doing the exciting stuff. And there's a lot of exciting stuff here. So we look at 10 canonical potential CDP business scenarios. And what we see very often with CDPs, either when you're selecting one or you already have one, is a really tactical approach. Let's solve this use case, let's solve that use case. And really what we recommend is you take a step back and say, what are we trying to accomplish from a business perspective? What's really important for us, and prioritize those use cases, which then drive the relevant customer data investments that we need to get there. So this is how we evaluate CDP vendors, but this is also where you ought to take a more strategic approach to your data investments and make sure they're aligned with particular business outcomes. And that's what's going to take you from scoring a 1 or a 2 in the data side of the benchmarking towards more of a 3 or a 4. Now, if we look at the content side, once again, it's a similar story here, where the future is really going to be found more in these enterprise foundation services. And in particular, the way that we see organizations maturing their content operations and maturing their omni-channel capabilities is transitioning from more simple digital asset management to what we call omni-channel content services, and specifically from a technology standpoint, omni-channel content platforms. So here again, there's a kind of a maturity model that we've laid out in our DAM and OCP streams, where you can go from DAM 1.0, which is essentially a standalone library. It's good as it goes. It's better than being completely disorganized. To DAM 2.0, which is DAM as a MarTech service. So you've got you're supplying some assets to systems of engagement. There's a one-way flow of information. That's fine. But it's not going to take you to the future, which is qualitatively something different, more of an omni-channel content platform. And so this is different than a simple DAM, in as much as, yeah, it manages images and media, but also narrative and data all as first-class objects. It's much more object-oriented, which means it can support component-level management and compound asset management, and really support a two-way flow of information, including usage and derivations. This then allows you to measure effectiveness in a much more fine-grained model. And then this then leads us to what we call Content 4.0, which is predictive content, much more automated, much stronger use of AI and ML to drive the sorts of variants and experiences that you need, and to more innovatively measure those experiences and glean true insights from those. That's really Content 4.0. Really, to do that, you need omni-channel content services and likely an omni-channel content platform. This is a space that has emerged out of the digital asset management space, but this is really the future of where you can become more effective on the content side. Here again, many potential use cases here, some of them very essential, like marketing asset management, some of them very exciting, like micro experience syndication, content as a service, sales collateral management, advertising asset management. There's really quite a few interesting capabilities that you could subsume here. Of course, then what's needed is because of the multimodal nature of this and the potential to span across multiple channels, obviously, is a governance structure to support this. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, let's talk about decisioning. So that's the final third pillar that you have on the right. Many of you are self-reporting that you have good, that you have a strong effectiveness in terms of your test and optimize cycles. That's because many of you have built an actual program. And so our recommendation is that you take that same program expertise and apply it to personalization and journey orchestration. And the reason for that is we often see personalization and journey orchestration as like these one-off projects, as opposed to taking a real program and doing test and learn around that and continuously optimizing what you're doing. The pilot may not be very successful. We often see unsuccessful pilots for personalization and then the company gives up on it, when really what you need to do is develop an iterative ongoing program. It might be a little bit more modest than a full-blown pilot, but it's something that you continue to work on, continue to learn, and that's where the value and the KPI movement comes, is by constantly sort of iterating and improving the decisions that your platforms are making. Obviously, there's a big play here for AI as well, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you know, journey orchestration is an area where many of you have communicated a lot of frustration to us. There's certainly a lot of need for education here. We think the best way to increase business readiness is through education and focus on use case support. If you look in the lower left, a really good place to start is journey listening. If you're not actually listening to what's happening and getting real data as opposed to what you think is happening, then you're not doing it right. So you really need to be able to do quantitative and qualitative journey listening, understand how your prospects and customers are interacting with you across channels, and then focus on improving those journeys. And so the ones that we see in particular are really amenable to this approach tend to be around lifecycle marketing, very often service and support related. You see some immediate wins. So there's a lot of long-term promise here, but it requires a pretty substantial amping up of business readiness. And again, this issue, because we're talking multi-channel here, of operational readiness and governance across departments within the enterprise. Now, you saw AI at the top of each one of these, and obviously there's a lot of excitement and a lot of interesting testing going on around AI. We'll have a webinar next week on AI technology. Certainly a lot of interest now around generative AI. But what we're learning is that when we do these things in isolation, oftentimes there then is a request, well, what did we learn out of this? What can we take? What measures did we move? And so that's calling for then more sort of insights-driven AI. And then that in turn is leading us to then sort of how can we make better and more effective use of AI in terms of the decisions and the predictive recommendations that we're going to be making. And so AI, we're learning, is not just sort of a one-shot injection into a particular application. That very often doesn't really move the needle, at least not strategically. But you have to be thinking about enterprise integration here. And this in turn requires enterprise governance. And so integration is going to be a bit of a challenge because we know that none of the vendors do all three of these very well. So you are going to be integrating your AI capabilities into both with other AI capabilities and within your broader stack. And of course, governance becomes really critical here. Again, we'll have more to say about the AI for marketing marketplace more next week, but it's really interesting. There's a lot of generative specialists, a lot of energy around that right now. There's also some nominally multi-function platforms, but they're suite dependent. And then some other multi-function platforms that are more infrastructure dependent. some serious issues around both of those. So if I go back to the previous slide, there's no single vendor that's going to close the loop for you here. That's work that you're going to have to do yourself, but that's where a lot of the value lies. Now, I've mentioned governance at least 3 times now, and operations. We asked some tough questions during if you go and try the benchmarking. This is the very first set of questions that we ask out of the categories here of operations, content, data, decisioning, and technology. We start right out with governance and then get into collaboration. And these are some tough questions that we're asking. And what we've learned over time is that there's no single recipe for governance and operations. There are, however, many cookbooks. And your enterprise probably already knows how to make this dish. So in other words, we really encourage organizations to lean on some of their existing governance structures, some of which may need to be modified for this omni-channel journey. Others maybe can be used already as they exist. But the key thing here is that marketing really needs to take the lead on omni-channel governance. Is that if marketing doesn't take the lead, no one else will. So that's a bit of a rallying cry for 2024 to increase your effectiveness across all of these different cones. It's going to also require really upping your game with respect to operations and governance. So I want to remind you, if you had any questions or comments, anything you disagree with or agree with, or any vignettes you want to share, please do use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll have some time for that coming up here shortly. In the meantime, I wanted to leave you with some takeaways. If you've tried this benchmark already and you scored fairly low and you feel bad about that, don't. Most enterprises score fairly low. There's definitely a lot of room for improvement, and part of this process is to give you something aspirational, something to reach for, and help you identify where are the roadblocks that you do need to overcome. You might want to initially focus more on finding some balance than the overall totals. In other words, are you very far ahead of your peers in one dimension, but very far behind in another? What are the implications of this? It could be that there's going to be some lurking challenges in your future. From a platform standpoint, there's many of the major roadblocks you're going to need to overcome by conducting what we call stack Pilates, or really working on your foundation, your core, your base, the capabilities that can be applied across channels. That's where the maturity and effectiveness comes. That's also what you're going to need to do to be effective with AI as well. Then fourth, you want to practice what we call MarTech. So of course, we've been talking a lot about MarTech, but there's a third player in the room, which is data. And so we need marketing, data, and tech to work together. I know many of you have spent the last 5 to 10 years trying to integrate your marketing and tech operations. Many of you have made great strides there. Now we have to add a third person to the room around data, and the 3 of those groups now need to work together if you're going to improve your effectiveness. AI and ML are very shiny, very exciting. They're a little bit closer to the end of the rainbow than the beginning, which is a way of saying that you need to do a lot of work internally to truly leverage AI and ML from a strategic standpoint, as opposed to just gaining a few ephemeral tactical wins, which is really getting your data house in order, making sure you've got good data in, good content in, otherwise you're going to get garbage out, whether it's AI or ML. And then finally, you will need some cross-functional governance leadership to really raise the bar here. Many of the barriers that we see around things like journey orchestration, omnichannel content operations, yeah, they're partly technical, but in many cases they're organizational as well. And the organizational limitations can be decisive. Marketing really needs to step forward here, get the major players together, but take the lead in terms of unblocking this flow and really making sure that customers are seeing the best of your organization. Once again, you can benchmark yourself and see where you're doing well and less well relative to your peers at any time. And if you have any feedback on that, we'd certainly welcome hearing from you. So speaking of feedback, there's 3 different ways that you can work with Real Story Group going forward. The first one is we can help you find the best fit vendor in whatever subway line that you're on here. You can use our research and our tools, including our Real Quadrant tool, the Real Score tool, to really make sure that you end up with the best fit. The second way that you can work with us is to license all of our research, and then we help you with what we call a full stack subscription, which is our being able to support not just your individual vendor decisions, but how to optimize your stack on an ongoing basis and help you essentially improve your scores from one year to the next. A subset of those companies join our MarTech Leadership Council. This is a private peer group of only enterprise MarTech leaders. We meet several times a year, once or twice in person, 2 or 3 times virtually. We just had an in-person meeting in November where we talked about AI and organizational models. We'll be meeting virtually here in mid-December, and then in person again in North America and Europe next year. So once again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put those in the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. Otherwise, Scott, we'll leave it to you to just talk about next steps.
Great, absolutely. And for anyone that's looking to fill out the MarTech effectiveness model, that link is in the chat window, so you can go to that and fill that out. You can also download excerpts from any of our research areas that you see here. And as Tony mentioned, AI research will be available next week, and there will be another webinar at this time next week where we'll take a deeper look into that research and some of the key players within that space. With that, Tony, any questions that you see on your side?
Yeah, so one question is from Jeremy. We're getting a lot of pressure to go with a single vendor who will break through all of these barriers for us and essentially give us one throat to choke. Well, we hear that a lot, Jeremy, and that a single vendor can essentially solve all of your omni-channel problems for you and simplify these complicated integration issues and governance issues that I talked about. But the reality is that that's a total myth. You take any vendor like Microsoft, Oracle, Adobe, Salesforce, SAP, their suites are incomplete, cobbled together by a variety of different heterogeneous platforms. You know, it may be a single invoice, but you're still going to be dealing with different product teams. It's not going to be a holistic solution. And a vendor doesn't make you omni-channel. Your stack makes you omni-channel. You can build an omni-channel stack. Every stack is composable. It's just a question of how composable. So you need to line up vendors head to head for particular capabilities that are high priority for you, test them out, and then pick the best fit. You owe that to your shareholders, and you owe that to your peers as well. So we have a lot more thoughts about that. If you check out our LinkedIn page, you can see certainly some stories about what it's been like working with Adobe and the rest. So with that, we're running short on time. Know there are other questions, certainly happy to handle some of those offline. But as always, a pleasure spending half an hour of our time together. For Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne signing off for now. So long.